One of the hardest things to care about is the rights of other people. We all care about our own rights, but it's really hard for us to visualize that other people would care about their rights. It's really been a frustrating process that one liberal economist after another, beginning with Adam Smith, continuing down to our own day to P.T. Bauer and Milton Friedman and Amartya Sen, they say over and over again, freedom and self-determination and agency are ends in themselves. They should be ends in themselves. So don't violate that in the course of development, but they keep losing that battle that everyone's concentrating on material development and not on the rights of other people.
Welcome to Season 2 of Our Long Walk, a podcast series about South Africa's past, present and future. I'm Johan Fourie from Stellenbosch University, and as always, I'm joined by Wits University's brilliant Jonathan Schoots.
With Johan's expertise in economic history and my expertise in historical sociology, we are excited to interview world-leading academics who ask compelling questions about our country, our continent, and the ideas shaping the world around us.
Welcome to the Our Long Walk podcast, and today we're delighted to have William Easterly as our guest. Bill insists that he is a terrible ballroom dancer, which is reassuring because in almost every other respect, Bill Easterly has spent a career making uncomfortable arguments with unusual clarity. He is Professor Emeritus of Economics at New York University and Co-Director Emeritus of the NYU Development Research Institute. Easterly is the author of Violent Saviors, The West's Conquest of the Rest, which was released in November last year. And he has also authored many other books, most of which I at some stage prescribed to my students, including The Tyranny of Experts, The White Man's Burden, and The Elusive Quest for Growth. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you, Johan.
So, Bill, let me start with The Elusive Quest for Growth, which is your first book. And you, in that book, argue economists kept trying to find this elixir to help poor countries, especially tropical countries, grow. I remember this kind of literature of the 1990s. When I was a student, we would read these papers trying to find and explain the Africa dummy, for example. Looking back from where we are today, what have we learned since that genuinely changed your opinion or the growth prospects of these countries? Have we identified new ways of thinking, policy lessons, or have we finally given up and just let countries find their own solutions?
Well, we certainly haven't made any progress on finding the elixir that rapidly gets countries out of poverty. I guess if I think about my own development over time, which is not that interesting, but just as one possible indicator, I think over time I became much more sensitive to the violation of people's rights that were on the receiving end of aid, which is not something I really cared about at all, to be honest, in the first book or even the second book. And I think since then it's become more obvious that there can be really huge human rights violations in the course of development. Mm-hmm. Ethiopia's leader, Meles Zenawi, doing development by taking farmers at gunpoint away from their lands and forcing them to settle in model villages sponsored by the state that didn't have water or such basic ingredients to agriculture and herding as that. And we used to and we still do, just automatically approve any dictator who produces rapid growth, which was happening in Ethiopia when this was happening. And that there's something that I think bothered some of us about that can't be quite right to just approve any dictator, any rights violations just because there's rapid growth.
And that takes me into so many different questions. And the one question that I've been hoping to ask you is about exactly this idea of outside or external kind of autocracy, or the idea that we as a development community, as experts, dictate, which you, in your new book, Violent Saviors, really are opposed to. But then on the other hand, you have these sometimes elected, but often autocratic leaders internally in countries. And so how do we differentiate between giving people the freedom to choose their own leaders, but then having to accept the outcomes that some of these leaders then produce?
So in this new book, I really wanted to study the history of colonialism because that was such a good example of violent saviors, of Western armies and leaders imposing their development plans on somebody else, whether it be slaves or Native Americans or Congolese under Leopold's Congo, at the point of a gun using violence, claiming to people to conquer them for their own good, which was a ridiculous and not very popular notion with the victims of that conquest. And then I think there was progress in moving away from that kind of explicitly colonial approach to development. And what did that do? I think it just removed one possible source of violent coercion for the sake of development. It didn't automatically create freedom or the absence of violence for what was left behind. So it's very much true that one kind of violence was replaced by another in many independent states, say in Africa. After the colonial violence was removed, there was domestic violence of the autocrat. But that doesn't invalidate the progress that was made by taking away at least one source of violence that was really counterproductive and horrible for the victims.
One thing that you talk about in the kind of early stages of this new book is you talk about this development right of conquest. And I thought that this turn to colonialism as a kind of root of development thinking is really powerful. And you use John Winthrop as this example where the idea of improvement is taken as this justification for control or domination. So maybe for the listener, could you tell us a little bit more about this idea of the development right of conquest and John Winthrop and how he embodies this in the Massachusetts Bay Colony?
Yeah, in 1629, John Winthrop is about to launch an enterprise of settling English people in Massachusetts, which had already had contact from 1620 with the Pilgrims on the Mayflower. And he brought up a perspective for potential settlers and investors in which he tried to allay concerns, which apparently already existed, that this was going to be violating the rights of the Indians when we Europeans went there. And he said, oh, no, don't worry. He pictured an Indian on the seal of what would later be the seal of the Massachusetts colony saying, come over and help us, which was actually a fictional Indian that didn't really exist. And he said, look, we're going to give the Indians really valuable agricultural knowledge. And yeah, we'll take away a lot of their land, but the land they have left, they will have much more productive use of it because of our great agricultural knowledge that we're bringing them. And really, it's a good deal for them, too. So that was kind of the very beginning of the development right of conquest, the justified conquest, because it's conquest for the sake of the conquered, supposedly. Of course, there was no process by which Indians would be consulted, like the local Pequot Indians who were later massacred by Winthrop's forces. There was no process by which they were consulted whether they thought this was a good idea, whether they thought this was a good exchange to give away their land for Europeans' agricultural knowledge, which notoriously at the beginning the Indians had to give the Europeans their knowledge to survive, to avoid famine.
Why, Bill, do we keep on thinking that this time we'll get it right? Throughout your book, it just feels like we are repeating the same thinking over and over. You've got Washington's claim there as like one path for Native Americans to modern day development blueprints. It just feels like it's the same mistake over and over. I think of our first guest, Bronwyn Everall, who wrote a book, Africanomics, which she basically highlights similar kind of attempts, of foreigners coming in, thinking that they have the answers, and actually just ruining what was already on the ground, making it worse. Why do we just not get it right? Why is it so difficult to understand that we shouldn't think of ourselves as having this development right?
Yeah, it seems like one of the hardest things to care about is the rights of other people. We all care about our own rights, but it's really hard for us to visualize that other people would care about their rights. It's really been a frustrating process that one liberal economist after another, beginning with Adam Smith, continuing down to our own day to P.T. Bauer and Milton Friedman and Amartya Sen. They say over and over again, freedom and self-determination and agency are ends in themselves. They should be ends in themselves. So don't violate that in the course of development. But they keep losing that battle that everyone's concentrating on material development and not on the rights of other people. The good news in this, though, is the fact that they feel the need for moral justification of their conquests. It's in a perverse way good news because it says they do recognize there's a moral question going on. And implicitly, they do open themselves up to the charge of hypocrisy, that they want rights for themselves but not for other people. And that can be an engine of progress, as it was with the end of slavery, as it was with the end of the worst abuses, the Congo under King Leopold in the early 1900s, and I think as it was with the end of colonialism.
You make this contrast between the kind of vision of Condorcet and of Smith. And Condorcet, you say, is wanting an increase in this kind of material wealth, to decrease the gap between different nations and persons, with each generation able to better satisfy their needs, to lengthen the human life, these kinds of things. And I think that I really like this because I think that does capture a kind of perhaps taken for granted or unreflected emphasis on materiality. And then the kind of thrust here is no material development without agency is lost. But in that framework, I think there's something about material benefit that's easily measured. And so you can say, oh, progress is happening because it's measurable. Do you think that kind of progress towards liberty can also be measured? Is there something about the difficulty of seeing progress in this less countable realm? And how can we count progress towards liberty?
I think at the very least, we can see like really stark examples of violations of liberty that we can see happening that we can just argue is an objective phenomenon that certainly is observable. In Condorcet's case, the most remarkable negative thing he was saying is that, anything that raises GDP per capita, obviously, although he didn't use that concept explicitly, but something very much like that is good because that leads to progress, material objective progress. And yet he was willing to say, oh, by the way, some groups will probably have to disappear in the course of material development. They're just too backward. It's too hopeless. They just have to give way to more progressive people, more advanced people. And you read between the lines, pretty clear he's talking a lot about Native Americans and Africans especially. Mm-hmm. I think that's shocking and objective enough that you can say, oh, yeah, it's not that hard to measure gross violations of liberty. They're lying out there in plain sight. They're objectively measurable by the degree of violence, the degree of deaths. So I don't think it's only a problem of lack of measurement.
I agree fully with the idea that commerce is better than coercion. But I wonder about, does that apply to all commerce? So is it, if I think about the 18th century Cape, where we are, there was trade, but it wasn't a coercive form of trade almost. It was brandy being traded for land. And you can think of many, maybe not equally unequal relationships today. You can think of many externalities, negative externalities in trade patterns. You think of the environment. You might even think of sports betting markets. So how should we think about commerce? Is that inevitably good? So trade, is that inevitably a good thing? Are there also constraints, restraints that we should have there?
Yeah, I mean, this book is very far from saying commerce is always good. And if anything, the opposite. People who subscribe to commerce is always good kind of ideology are missing a huge thing lying in plain sight, which is historically commerce has involved a lot of coercion. Mm-hmm. And other forms of more subtle coercion like deception and cheating, like you're alluding to the process by which Native Americans were deprived of their land, and sometimes because there was just deception as to what they're agreeing to. Mm. Sometimes the treaty was with a Native American leader who didn't have the ownership rights over that land, was happy to give it away for his own agenda or for a supply of brandy or whatever, as you indicated. When the abolitionist campaign was trying to abolish the British slave trade, after the abolition was successful in 1808, one of the leaders said, we finally have achieved something like having, quote, moral boundaries to our commerce. Mm-hmm. So that's the key phrase. Commerce has to have moral boundaries to be mutually beneficial to both sides. And I think you're raising some more subtle kinds of externalities today, that there could be environmental consequences, but also those could also be defined as being coercively imposed on someone else who hasn't agreed to them, that wasn't a party to the contract. So I think the coercion framework is a pretty good one for signaling what's good and bad about commerce.
One thing I really loved about this book is this very clear foregrounding of there have been promises of moral projects. So this like development as, development is good. And even if it's by force, we're going to have progress. That as a kind of moral, I don't know if it's a mask or if it's kind of part and parcel of a process of exploitation. And I liked what you said earlier, like the need to have a moral justification is potentially an engine for making ground here. But I wanted to ask, this is a question I've had a lot as I was reading the book. So I want to read two quotes, one from Smith from your book, and then another quote from Pascal. So these quotes from Smith, you say, every man is no doubt by nature first and principally recommended to his own care. And then by this, each person is, and I continue the quote, fitter to take care of himself than any other person. And another quote here, every man, as long as he does not violate the law of justice, is left perfectly free to pursue his own interests in his own way. And so this kind of self-knowledge of well-being as a kind of driver of liberalism. But really there, that bit about does not violate the law of justice is the heart of the question. And so there's this quote by Pascal where he's talking about justice and force and how do we have just force? So I'll just read it. It is right that what is just should be obeyed. It is necessary that what is strongest should be obeyed. Justice without might is helpless. Might without justice is tyrannical. And then he goes on to say, justice is subject to dispute. Might is easily recognized and not disputed. So we cannot give might to justice because might has gainsaid justice and has declared that it is she herself who is just. And thus, being unable to make what is just strong, we have made what is strong just. And I thought that this really somehow captures this idea of this kind of development right of conquest, is that the people who are wanting to conquer look for a moral covering and they find one. But how do we do the opposite? How do we say injustice needs the strength to be able to push off the force that is imposed on it? And how does a moral call get us somewhere beyond just decrying injustice?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's important to think of the classical liberal voices in this as being, they contribute a lot more by their skepticism. They don't really offer like a blueprint for how these nice outcomes that they want are going to happen. They're more just like offering a skeptical rejoinder to the development right of conquest. Can we really trust you violent saviors to really be saviors and not act in your own interests? No, I don't think so. And the second kind of skepticism is, if this is so good for the conquered, why is conquest even necessary? Why didn't they voluntarily accept it without conquest? And those kind of skepticism, you can think of, they're not at all sketching out the blueprint for how the injustice is going to be fought, what the campaign is going to look like, what the transition path is going to look like. They answer none of those questions. So you could ridicule them as being like hopelessly useless and just random idealism with no consequence. If you did try to attach force to the rebellion against injustice, you can easily create new kinds of injustices. The liberal imperialists who conquer a country claiming to bring it freedom. You can think of that as just another kind of development conquest, as you could argue was really happening in the modern day with Iraq and Afghanistan, and that did not turn out well.
Your book is incredibly timeous, it feels, at this moment. What's happened in the last 3 or 4 months, I'm sure you could not have seen these events while you were writing this book. I was quite surprised by reading about John Quincy Adams's let's not go in search of monsters to destroy. It seems like wonderful advice for many governments at the moment. What do you think are the policy lessons? I know that's a terrible kind of phrase to use, but how would you advise a government intended on finding these monsters to destroy? Is it just not to do that? Are there other things that we can learn that we should resist or perhaps should follow?
Yeah, I mean, certainly Greenland and Venezuela are good examples of just another development right of conquest. It's interesting that these things by the U.S. administration are not largely claiming that it's in the benefit of the people being conquered. It's not really phrased that much for the benefit of Greenlanders or Venezuelans. It's more like an older kind of development right of conquest that claims, forget about the people, we can just develop this land better than those people can themselves if they were left to themselves. And also just naked self-interest. This is just good for the U.S. and we don't care who else it affects. And that one is even harder to fight because there is what we were talking about earlier, at least with the attempt to have a moral justification, you're opening yourself up to a moral counter-argument. If you're just saying we're doing this in our own self-interest and we don't care about anybody else, that's harder to fight.
So you have this quote where eventually commerce replaces conquest and consent replaces coercion. And I wonder what the driver of this shift is. And I want to point to a piece that you quote from Smith, which I think is really interesting, where you say Smith had this kind of almost prophetic vision of a time when countries grow stronger, and I'm quoting here, countries grow stronger to arrive at the quality of courage and force, which inspires mutual fear and thus demands mutual respect for the rights of others. And so once countries become strong enough, then there's a transformation from conquest to commerce or to consent. I wonder if you think that's true, and what is at the root of this kind of equalizing? Is economic growth a kind of prerequisite for an equalizing that Smith sees as being able to create this kind of greater equality amongst nations?
Yeah, both parts of that quote are remarkably accurate for something that was made, a prediction that Smith made 250 years ago.
Yeah.
The moral thing he was saying, that there'd be sort of moral progress to respecting the rights of other nations. But then he was also saying, which I think turned out to be remarkably accurate, that trade itself would also involve trade in like military armaments, which eventually would be very cheap to buy. And then the victims of the conquest would be able to resist the conquerors much more effectively, and that would give more of an incentive for the conquerors to kind of break with their own hypocrisy and respect the rights of others. So, this is not really an empirical claim about how much is moral progress and how much is dissemination of armaments or other kinds of self-interest or objective factors. It's more just saying don't neglect the moral debate as an engine of progress. We don't know how large it was, but it seems like it mattered.
I want to pivot a little bit to methodology, Bill, and specifically speak about my profession, economics, and yours, and specifically development economics. You've been saying that RCTs, randomized control trials, is a great way of disciplining kind of grand plans, but they, again, typically optimize material outcomes, right? We want to see whether extra books in a classroom make a difference to class outcomes, health, you can think of many other outcomes, income, and not really the thing that you mentioned here, which is this liberty, what to economists might be quite a fuzzy, unimmeasurable thing. So how do we think of applying an RCT framework, or which framework should we apply if we wanted to study not only material progress, but also choice, trust, these kinds of other outcomes that we care about?
Yeah. First, let me say that I found really instructive the writings that I was going through. Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee, the big proponents of RCTs and Nobel laureates, of course. They are very much aware of this desire for dignity and agency among poor peoples around the world. And they tried to figure out their own trade-offs, where in the end they say something, I think Esther said this in one of her lectures, that it's pretty obvious the material things that people want, like reductions in infant mortality. So let's not bother in that case too much about self-determination or agency. Let's just do whatever's necessary to get lower infant mortality. And that's certainly a defensible view. I think maybe that view is a little bit too abused in the common practice, that you're not. First of all, there's one really elementary thing that has been raised by some critics of RCTs, which is the need to have the consent of the research subjects. And of course, that's respected. That's a big thing that goes on in committees that approve this research on human subjects. But I don't think that's really widely respected enough in this. And also, do the research subjects themselves benefit from any of this? Sometimes they do if it's rolled out in phases, but sometimes not. So there is possibly a form of RCT imperialism that we need to take seriously and worry more about than what the profession does now.
And just out of curiosity, where do you see development economics heading? What is it that the field is uncovering, discovering now that helps ultimately achieve this goal of greater material progress and liberty and choice?
Yeah, people who eventually ran out of enthusiasm for RCTs and got bored by the methodology, they kept predicting and hoping that there would be a shift away from RCTs back towards bigger questions, macro policies that are good for development. And they kept predicting that, but 20 years of predictions have not been proven true on that question. RCTs really keep going strong. I think that debate is happening, but the side who wants more big questions, more discussion of things like democracy and property rights and macroeconomic stability, that side of the argument has been losing that debate mostly for 25 years now. So it's interesting to see if that will change or if it'll just keep happening.
I mean, you've got a 2019 NBR working paper, In Search of Reforms for Growth, which I actually cite in my book, which I find fascinating because I do think that this Washington Consensus era of reforms in the 80s, but specifically the 90s, have been misinterpreted. The Washington Consensus, for listeners unfamiliar with it, is the package of market-oriented reforms. So things like fiscal discipline, trade and financial liberalization, privatization, deregulation, these kinds of things. And it was often promoted in crisis-hit developing countries, particularly in Latin America and Africa. And you, in that paper, make this case. And in fact, you show how you change your own views compared to what you wrote in the early 2000s. And then when the data basically improved, and about a decade later, we could actually observe what these consequences were. So what is the current consensus on the Washington Consensus? I mean, it links up exactly with what you just said, like the shift has been to RCTs with these micro interventions away from these big macro questions. But is it now time to perhaps reflect a bit more on the successes? I say that with care, but successes of the Washington Consensus era in the 2000s and 2010s.
Yeah, I think the Washington Consensus is still a long way from being a consensus among either developing countries or people in developed countries. It's too useful as kind of a brush with which to tar things you don't like. Concepts like free markets or free trade, neoliberalism, or whatever pejorative term. So it's still, very unpopular. I think what got lost is just there could have been agreement that at the very least, this really got rid of the most extreme, stupid policies. We're having extreme restrictions on trade, extremely high black market premiums, extremely high inflation rates. That mostly, not entirely, and it could, of course, be totally reversed, but that mostly sort of went away, and the Washington Consensus gets some credit for that, and I think domestic policymakers get some credit for that. So that could have been a good outcome that both sides could have agreed on, but that didn't happen. I think the anti-consensus side still found it too useful to use the Washington Consensus as a hammer with which to hammer the things they didn't like.
So this pursuit of increasing the voice, the participation, the kind of rights, the needs of the poor and of the excluded, I'm sure this is true in academia everywhere. It's certainly true in my discipline, that there is a much greater global conversation now. And so the way that voice is often expressed in academia is that we have people from many more parts of the world participating in the conversation and challenging centers of power. But that's not necessarily an avenue for the poor and the excluded themselves. They are structurally excluded from those spaces often. And so I wonder, how is it that you also talk about how even these aid agencies who have these ideas of participatory development fall very short of real engagement with people and their needs? What kind of shifts do we make to bring in the voice of poor and marginalized people, especially those who are subjected to these attempts to develop their lives?
I myself learned an awful lot from some of my African colleagues, African economists, such as my great colleague at NYU, Yao and Yarko. And I think they really helped me to see more of the side of resenting the paternalism and the coercion, especially the paternalism, insulting paternalism that was going on in development. I don't want to generalize, make some stupid statement like Africans in general feel this way or something, but I certainly have learned a lot from some of my African colleagues on that issue. And, it's really kind of a striking disparity sometimes when I give talk. Those who have European or white American background, they're like, what is this about? Whereas some of these specific African colleagues I have in mind are like, oh yeah, this is telling them what they need to know. This is really getting it. And I found that really encouraging, mostly because I learned those things from some of my colleagues like Yao and Yarko.
I mean, on that point, if we think about your work on aid and critiques of aid, often also with support from African scholars themselves. I mean, we've seen now in practice, about a year ago, Elon Musk and his Doge come in and completely dismantle, to some extent, US aid. It's almost like a performative rejection of the whole aid apparatus. Now, you might share, I guess you share, and many of us share many of the critiques of aid, but this abrupt dismantling seems to also raise questions about justice itself. It shifts costs on vulnerable people who did not choose that specific system and cannot easily insure themselves from this withdrawal of aid funding. How should a liberal think about this? I was surprised, to be quite honest, to read many of my colleagues here on the continent write in a somewhat supportive way about this dismantling, saying that finally we are forced to stand on our own feet. We've been for too long too dependent on this aid system. How do one trade off the fact that there are people that really suffer, and certainly in South Africa with the cutting of the US aid and the funding that went to aid specifically, that really had really detrimental consequences for a lot of people. But yet the longer term view of we now have to stand on our own feet is quite a popular one certainly amongst scholars on the continent. How should I think about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a hard one because I certainly would agree that aid was not doing that great to begin with. So don't base your critique of the cuts on some rosy view that aid was doing wonderful things and now this has been snatched away and is going to have horrible consequences. That doesn't really follow to me. At the same time, there's a question of even if you wanted less aid, what does the transition path look like from where we are now to the outcome of less aid? And probably blowing things up all at once is probably not, doesn't strike me as the ideal transition path, especially because it, as you said, it itself is coercive. It's violating some contracts that were there that are now violated explicitly. A larger set of implicit contracts were violated. And also, it's not discriminating. Of course, aid, when saying aid does not do well, is a statement about averages, about average performance. Of course, behind the average, there's some things are doing really well and other things doing really badly. And, pretty widely agreed that the things that are doing the best were the health initiatives. Not all of them, but certainly a lot of the health initiatives have done a lot of good. Making drugs available to HIV positive people was obviously a big one. And then suddenly just snatching that away it's hard to see how that would be doing good.
So, Bill, one of the things that we do on the podcast is to play around with AI, with artificial intelligence. But before we get to the actual exercise, I do want to, it's probably a compliment more than a question, but it is rare to read a nonfiction book where I would burst out laughing at some of the lines. I'm very confident this book was not written by AI because it's just got the most wonderful lines. So any listener who is keen to actually enjoy a nonfiction book, it is incredibly well written. And so with that, just to say that we have two AI features. The one is that we take research by our guests and then we ask ChatGPT to create a verse or lyrics and we turn that into a song. So I'm going to play a song, and as I warned Jonathan before, this is a slightly out there attempt at taking some of your research. And so it's a plea by a fictional person who sings about, laments the arrival of Europeans on her continent. So let's see how it goes.
The first sound was not thunder, it was the hush that arrives before thunder. A line on the water where the morning should have been. Claws of cloud, then canvas, and a hard glint of iron. Then in our horizon by hearts, we had names for this shore, for that river mouth, for the places where the fish turn, where the stories turn. We had treaties with wind and drought, laws older than the salt in our blood. Yet you looked at us as if we were or the absence of a plan. You said the land lies idle. You said we will make it useful. You said we will teach you to be human in our image. And when we did no concepts, you wrote our refusal as ignorance, as laziness, as childishness, as sin. We learned your arithmetic early. You counted bodies as cost and called it progress. You measured the rise of storehouses while the songs went missing. You admire the straight road that cut through a village, then blame the village for being in the way. And still, even then, we knew a simpler bargain. Let there be trade without chains. Let there be exchange without the lie of superiority. Let us keep the right to say yes and the right to say no. The small herd that guards a people's dignity, but your experts arrive like a second tide with die-eyed wells for hunger and tables for grief. Place more as if we were pieces on their board, moved for the beauty of the pattern, not for the beating of our own will. They promised bread, then demanded our breasts. They promised fees, then practiced control. They promised a future and required that our past be erased. So the story would read clearly in their reports. If you would bring help, bring it like water, offer, not pour down a throat. Bring it with an ear, not a wet. Bring it with equality. Not pity dressed as love. Let the ones who left the course beside the toys, because the deepest theft was not only languor, labor, not only the children taken. The language is thin, but the forest renamed, the ancestors made into footnotes. The deepest theft was the taking of our right to consent to our own salvation. We were not empty, lad. We were not children. We were not all ladder to a bright. If you would walk with us, walk beside us, and let our yes be
That's amazing. It's incredible.
Yeah, it's taking some of the actually reviews of your book and then some of my own thoughts and mixing it all up into this lament. A different way of communicating science, I think, and some of these ideas. A second thing we do on the podcast is to ask a quirky question to the guest. But before we get there, I want to give myself and Jonathan a final question. And this is something that intrigues me from my own discipline, economic history, because you have written also a pretty well-cited seminal paper on the persistence of technology. And this paper is saying or asking, can we I'm going to simplify, but are we today, those of us whose ancestors had better technology, are we also likely to be more materially well off today? How I should think about persistence and policy with this kind of question. Because it can easily seem to someone outside that economists are in some sense fatalist or deterministic, that whatever happened historically explains the present. There's not much that we can do now, that policy can. So how should I think about a paper like this, about these, what has been broadly termed persistent studies papers? Should we not care about the things that change rather than the things that stay constant?
Yeah, I mean, when I teach those papers, not only my own, but lots of others that find kind of old things still are affecting the current outcomes today with quite remarkable explanatory power. But even when we have remarkable explanatory power, at best, we might have an R squared of maybe 0.5, 50% of the variation being explained. That still leaves the other 50% of variation up for grabs, with choices and factors that are being determined today by policymakers and citizens and other people trying to change things. So it's far from a mindless fatalism, I think.
I really love how the work you do here, turning to a kind of this like long history of conquest, turning to the history of colonialism as a kind of way to learn these powerful lessons, right? That you're calling to account because of this history of colonialism for where it goes wrong. I wonder if you have examples of other paths, even in small ways, paths only taken by some or paths not taken that could have been taken from your engagement in this history to think about other routes forward. Are there alternatives to celebrate that give us an orientation away from this orientation to domination and violence?
Yeah, that's a hard one. Unfortunately, there aren't a lot of great examples of kind of a liberal path chosen by or happening at all after kind of centuries of domination by the West. It seems like there's sort of very anti-liberal effect of domination by the West that usually leads to very anti-liberal responses. Things like violent communist approaches to resisting imperialism like Lenin and Mao. That led to millions of deaths, obviously. But in a way, in a much lower profile, there are these kind of unheralded examples of just countries that never resorted to that much violence and just kind of muddled along, taking advantage of international trade and later transitioning to democracy. Cases like Taiwan and South Korea would be good examples of that. Chile would be a pretty good example of that with some reversals. So, and I think there's a larger set of countries that are not quite the success story level that those are, but are still examples of just muddling along and doing pretty well without resorting to this kind of violent saviors approach to development.
Bill, I want to thank you very much. I'm going to end with this ChatGPT generated questions. The first one is, if you could add one footnote to every development report ever written, what would it say?
Well, let me think about which footnote. I think maybe the footnote would be at the end of every conclusion, footnote saying, by the way, we haven't asked the supposed beneficiaries whether they wanted this.
Which obvious development idea do you think future economic historians will find the most embarrassing?
Well, there's a kind of a large set of candidates for that one. I think the reliance on things like investment, maybe using like the cost of development programs as a measure of progress. Oh, we're spending a lot more on that problem, so we're making progress. Whereas in fact, spending a lot is a very poor predictor of doing anything good or making progress.
Bill Easterly, thank you very much for joining us. Appreciate your time.
Sure enough. Thank you.
That was wonderful.
Stay in touch in the future. This was really fun.
And please go out and buy and read Violent Saviors. It's a wonderful book and you'll have a wonderful time reading it. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you for listening to another episode of Season 2 of the Our Long Walk podcast. We'd love to hear from you. What's the one idea from today's conversation that changed your outlook? Do you have a burning question you'd like to explore, or perhaps a guest you'd love to hear from? Get in touch with us by sending an email to johan@ourlongwalk.com. That's JOHAN@ourlongwalk.com.
If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. You can follow us on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And we'd love your feedback. Visit us at ourlongwalk.com. Follow our LinkedIn page for updates, new episodes, and additional links.
This series is made possible by the Chair in Economics, History and Policy at Stellenbosch University. Visit leapstellenbosch.org for more information about our research unit in economic history.
Thanks to LEAP researcher Kelsey Lemon, who provided helpful background research. Thanks also to the team at Voice Note Productions for helping to make this podcast. Our producer is Vasti Calitz. Sound design and editing is done by Andri Burnett. Nkosi Johan.
Dankie, Jonathan. Join us next time for another episode of Our Long Walk.
See you then.
Cheers.